The darkness inside the Ashcroft stables held a texture like wet wool, thick, suffocating, pressing against Josiah Creed's skin until he could barely draw breath. He stood motionless in the central aisle, boots planted in straw that hadn't been changed in 3 days, the ammonia stench of horse waste burning his nostrils. Above him, the hayloft groaned under its burden of summer fodder, dried to perfect tinder after months without rain. The Virginia heat never left, not even at midnight. It hung in the rafters like an invisible predator, waiting. In his left hand, Josiah held a piece of flint. In his right, steel. His fingers trembled so violently he nearly dropped them both. The horses sensed something wrong. In their stalls, they shifted and snorted, hooves scraping against packed earth. Delilah, the ancient mare in the third stall, let out a low, anxious whicker. Josiah had raised her from a full 15 years ago, back when he still believed kindness existed in the world, back before he understood that the only kindness permitted a slave was the kindness he showed to beasts who couldn't betray him. "Hush now," he whispered, though his voice cracked. "I'll let you out. I'll let you all out. But first, the fire." His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The flint clicked against the steel once, twice, producing sparks that died before touching the straw at his feet. Josiah's breath came in shallow gasps. Sweat rolled down his temples despite the relative cool of night. He could still turn back. He could return to his quarters behind the laundry house, lie on his thin mattress, and pretend this night had never crept into his mind like poison into a well. He could live another day, and another, until death came for him naturally, or until Master Beauregard's temper did. The thought of Beauregard's name sent ice through Josiah's veins despite the heat. The memory came unbidden, as it had every night for the past week, Mercy's screams. She couldn't have been more than 13, 14 at most. A field hand's daughter, newly assigned to the house, still learning which fork the Ashcrofts preferred for fish and which for fowl. She'd been carrying a silver tray. Josiah remembered the way afternoon sunlight caught its polished surface, when Beauregard emerged from his father's study, already 3 drinks into his daily ration of bourbon. Josiah had been in the entrance hall, delivering a message from the stables about the mare's colic. He'd seen everything. Mercy had turned too quickly at the sound of Beauregard's boots. The tray tilted. A single crystal glass, imported from France, worth more than Mercy's life 10 times over, slid toward the edge. Beauregard caught it before it could fall. For one heartbeat, Josiah thought that would be the end of it. The glass was saved. No harm done. Then Beauregard smiled. "Clumsy girl," he'd said, his voice carrying that particular softness that preceded cruelty. "You nearly cost my father a pretty penny." "I'm sorry, Master Beauregard, sir," Mercy had whispered, eyes fixed on the floor as she'd been taught. "I'm so sorry, The first blow knocked her sideways. The tray clattered to the marble floor, a sound like bells tolling for the dead. Beauregard hit her again. And again. With his fists, with his riding crop that he pulled from his belt, with a fury that seemed to grow with each strike rather than diminish. He beat her there in the entrance hall while Josiah stood frozen, while other servants scattered like roaches from light, while Mercy's cries turned to whimpers and finally to silence. When it was over, Beauregard straightened his waistcoat, smoothed his hair, and walked away as if nothing had occurred. Left Mercy crumpled on the floor in a spreading pool of her own blood, one arm bent at an angle arms shouldn't bend. Josiah had helped carry her to the slave quarters. She'd lived, barely. But something in her eyes had died. When she looked at Josiah now, she looked through him, at something behind him, something only she could see. Old Delilah whinnied again, pulling Josiah back to the present, to the stable, to the flint and steel in his trembling hands. He struck them together. Sparks showered down, landing in the straw at his feet. This time, they didn't die. A thin thread of smoke curled upward, gray against the deeper darkness. A tiny orange glow appeared, no larger than a firefly's light. Josiah watched it, hypnotized. He could stamp it out. He could still choose survival over vengeance, cowardice over courage, though he no longer knew which was which. The smoke thickened. The orange glow spread, consuming one straw, then another, then 5, then 20. The fire whispered to itself in a language older than words. Josiah's paralysis broke. He moved with sudden, desperate purpose, unlatching stall doors one by one. The horses needed no encouragement, they smelled the smoke before he'd opened half the stalls, and those still trapped battered at their gates with wild eyes and wilder hooves. Delilah was first out, then Beauregard's black gelding Tempest, then the master's hunting horses and the carriage team, and finally the plow horses from the rear stalls. They thundered past him into the night, a river of muscle and terror flowing toward the paddocks and beyond, toward freedom they didn't know how to want but took anyway. Behind Josiah, the fire found the hayloft ladder. The flames climbed like a living thing, like something with intent and hunger. They reached the loft's edge and paused there for one eternal moment, as if gathering breath, as if choosing. Then they leaped. The dried hay caught with a sound like inhaled breath, a soft whoosh that became a roar. Fire blossomed across the loft in waves, beautiful and terrible, orange and red and gold and white hot at the center. Smoke poured from the loft opening in a thick black column, rising toward stars Josiah couldn't see. He should run. He should flee to the quarters, wake the others, let them decide their own fates. But his feet had grown roots into the stable floor. He stood transfixed, watching his handiwork spread across the structure that had been his prison for 32 years. The heat rolled over him in waves. Sweat turned to steam on his skin. The air itself seemed to shimmer and warp. And in that moment, as the stable transformed into a pillar of fire that would surely wake the main house, Josiah Creed felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not joy, the emotion was too complex for that simple word. Not satisfaction, the cost would be too high for satisfaction. What he felt was recognition. The fire knew him. It knew all of them, every soul trapped on this cursed plantation, every body broken by work and whip, every spirit crushed beneath the weight of chains visible and invisible. The flames reflected in Josiah's dark eyes, dancing there like demons, like angels, like the damned and the saved, all mixed together until they were indistinguishable. He thought of the Ashcrofts sleeping in their beds. Cornelius, the patriarch, who quoted scripture while selling children away from mothers. Lavinia, the matriarch, who tutade about propriety while permitting atrocity. Beauregard, whose cruelty seemed to grow with each passing season, as if he were perfecting an art form. He thought of Delilah, the head house servant, who had survived 40 years through silence and submission, whose face had forgotten how to form any expression but subservience. He thought of Augustus Thorne, the overseer, whose whip had scoured the backs of men stronger and better than he could ever be. He thought of Mercy, lying in the quarters, staring at nothing. The stable's roof beam cracked with a sound like thunder. Sparks fountained into the night sky, 1,000 fireflies freed from captivity, rising toward heaven or hell. Josiah no longer believed there was a difference. "It's done," he whispered to the fire, to the darkness, to whatever god or devil might be listening. "God forgive me, it's done." But even as he said it, Josiah knew forgiveness wasn't coming. Not from God, not from man, not from himself. What he'd started here tonight would demand payment in blood and ash and screams that would echo long after the flames died. The fire roared its approval, growing higher, brighter, hotter. It had taken the entire loft now and was reaching for the walls, for the roof, for everything. Josiah turned and ran, finally, his shadow thrown long and black across the ground by the inferno at his back. Behind him, the stable screamed its death throes into the night. Ahead of him, the main house sat dark and unaware, not yet knowing its world was ending. Above it all, smoke rose like a black hand reaching for the throat of heaven. And in that smoke, if one looked carefully, one might see shapes that weren't quite random, faces forming and dissolving, mouths opened in silent screams or laughter, it was impossible to tell which. The fire had awakened something more than flame. It had opened a door that had been locked for generations, and what waited on the other side was hungry. Josiah ran toward the quarters, toward the others, toward whatever came next. The fire's light chased him like an accusation, like a benediction, like the first page of a story written in ash and judgment. There would be no turning back now. The burning hour had come to the Ashcroft estate, and before dawn broke, nothing would remain as it was. Nothing would remain at all. If you're gripping your seat after that opening, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment below. Do you think Josiah was right to light that fire? What would you have done in his place? Let's discuss in the comments. Now, let's continue into the darkness. The bell began to ring at midnight, a frantic, arrhythmic clanging that shattered the fragile peace of sleeping quarters and main house alike. Augustus Thorne was first to hear it, jolting upright in his bed in the overseer's cottage with the instinct of a man accustomed to emergencies. He knew instantly, even before his feet touched the floor, that something had gone terribly wrong. Through his window, he could see the orange glow painting the night sky. "Fire," he breathed, then louder, bellowing as he pulled on his trousers, "Fire." His wife, Prudence, a thin woman with a perpetually worried face, scrambled from bed and began pulling on her dressing gown with shaking hands. "The stables? Has to be." Augustus grabbed his whip from its hook by the door, a habit so ingrained he didn't think about it, and burst into the night. The heat hit him immediately, even from 100 yards away. The stable wasn't just burning, it was being consumed, flames shooting 20 feet into the air, smoke billowing in great black clouds that blotted out the stars. But what stopped Augustus in his tracks, what sent ice through his belly despite the furnace heat, was the silence. Where were the screams? Where was the chaos of servants rushing with buckets, forming water lines, attempting to save what could be saved? The quarters sat dark and still, and though he could see figures standing in doorways, silhouetted against the firelight, none of them moved. They simply watched. "Get water!" Augustus roared, starting toward the slave quarters at a run. "Every able body, now! Move, you lazy!" He stopped. They were moving. But not toward the fire. They were stepping out from their quarters, one by one, two by two, gathering in the spaces between buildings. Augustus counted, 10, 15, 20, and more emerging with each second. They gathered in silence, their faces unreadable in the dancing shadows cast by the inferno. And they were looking at him. Augustus's hand tightened on his whip handle. Something was wrong. Something beyond the fire, something in the air itself, thick and electric like the moment before lightning strikes. He'd controlled these people for 12 years, had broken the strong ones and crushed the rebellious ones and made all of them understand the natural order of things. But the way they looked at him now. They looked at him like men looked at cattle before slaughter. "I said move." His voice cracked slightly, and he hated himself for it. "That fire spreads to the main house, the master will have all your hides. Get water, get buckets, get." "No." The word came from the darkness between two cabins. A single syllable, spoken quietly, but it carried across the yard like a judge's gavel. Josiah Creed stepped into the firelight. He was covered in soot, his shirt torn, his eyes reflecting the flames with an intensity that made Augustus's skin crawl. But it was his stillness that frightened the overseer most, a complete lack of the hunched, defensive posture that marked every slave on the plantation. Josiah stood straight, shoulders back, and in his right hand he held a pitchfork. "What did you say?" Augustus raised his whip, the leather uncoiling with a familiar hiss. "You dare speak to me without." "I said no." Josiah took another step forward. "No more." The slaves gathered behind him. Augustus heard their footsteps, the rustle of fabric, the breathing of 30, 40, 50 people moving as one. His heart hammered against his ribs. This couldn't be happening. This was Virginia, this was the South, this was the natural order God himself had ordained. Slaves didn't gather. They didn't refuse. They didn't look at a white man with anything but fear and deference. "You'll hang for this," Augustus said, trying to inject authority into his voice even as he took an involuntary step backward. "All of you. I'll see every last one of you swing before." The smoke from the stable shifted. It shouldn't have, there was no wind, but it moved anyway, pouring across the ground like a living thing, flowing between the gathered slaves and wrapping around Augustus's ankles. He looked down and for just a moment, less than a heartbeat, he saw faces in the smoke. Dozens of faces. Hundreds. All the faces of all the people he'd broken, some dead now, some alive, all watching him with empty eyes. When he looked up, Josiah was closer. "Back." Augustus cracked the whip, the sound sharp as a gunshot. The leather struck the ground inches from Josiah's feet, but the man didn't flinch. "I'll flay the skin from your—" A woman's voice cut through the night, stopping Augustus mid-threat. "You won't." Delilah emerged from the shadow of the main quarters, and Augustus felt his certainty crumble further. Delilah, who had served in the main house for 4 decades, who had been the very model of obedience, who had raised 3 generations of Ashcroft children with patience and quiet dignity, Delilah, who had never once raised her voice or her eyes in defiance. She was 60 years old, her hair gone completely white, her back bent from years of carrying trays and washing linens and scrubbing floors. But as she walked toward Augustus Thorne, something about her seemed larger than her physical form. The firelight caught in her eyes, and what Augustus saw there made his bladder clench. "We're done being afraid of you," Delilah said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had already died inside and was therefore beyond any threat. "We're done being afraid of any of you." "The master will," Augustus tried. "The master is sleeping," Delilah interrupted, "as he's slept through our suffering for decades. But not tonight. Tonight, he wakes." Behind her, more figures emerged from the main house itself, kitchen workers, laundry women, the groundskeepers. They'd been inside. The realization hit Augustus like a physical blow. While he'd been sleeping, they'd already infiltrated the house. The bell was still ringing, but now Augustus understood it wasn't a call for help. It was an announcement. A declaration. The sound of old chains breaking. He raised his whip again, but his hand was shaking. "You'll die for this. All of you will die. The militia will come, and they'll make examples of you that'll be talked about for." Josiah struck. The pitchfork buried itself in Augustus's shoulder, punching through fabric and flesh with a wet, meaty sound. Augustus screamed, a high-pitched shriek that seemed to shatter the last restraints holding the gathered slaves in check. They surged forward, a wave of bodies and rage and decades of accumulated suffering finally finding its release. Augustus went down beneath them, still screaming, his whip falling from nerveless fingers. But even as they bore him to the ground, even as fists and feet and implements rained down upon him, something strange happened. The shadows grew teeth. Between the beating bodies, in the spaces where firelight couldn't reach, the darkness congealed into shapes that shouldn't exist. Augustus saw them through the legs and arms of his attackers, things that moved with purpose, things with too many limbs or not enough, things that watched with interest as he was destroyed. When one of the shapes reached for him with something like a hand, Augustus felt a cold so profound it burned worse than any fire. His screams changed pitch, rising to a register of pure terror that transcended physical pain. And then Josiah pulled the others back. "Stop," he commanded, and they obeyed, stepping away from Augustus's broken form. The overseer lay in the dirt, his face a ruin of blood and torn flesh, his breath coming in wet bubbles. But he was alive. Barely, but alive. "Why?" someone asked, a young man named Silas, his knuckles split and bleeding. "He deserves." "Because we're not him," Josiah said quietly. "We're not them. We stop when it's done." But even as he said it, Josiah felt something disagreeing with him. A presence in the smoke, in the fire's roar, in the darkness between buildings. Something that had been sleeping beneath the plantation soil, fed by years of blood and tears and unavenged deaths. Something that had woken when the first spark caught the hay. It didn't care about justice or mercy or the line between necessary violence and needless cruelty. It was hungry, and it had been starved for far too long. Delilah felt it too. She turned toward the main house, where lights were finally beginning to appear in windows. "They're waking," she said. "Good." Josiah picked up Augustus's fallen whip. The leather felt strange in his hands, both foreign and familiar, like holding a serpent that had been defanged but not declawed. "Let them wake. Let them know what's coming." Behind him, the stable collapsed with a groan of timber and a shower of sparks that reached toward heaven like prayers from the damned. The fire spread to the carriage house, to the storage sheds, to anything made of wood and filled with the labor of enslaved hands. In the main house, Cornelius Ashcroft appeared at a second-story window in his nightshirt, his face pale as death in the firelight. He looked down at the gathered slaves, at Augustus's broken body, at the flames consuming his property. For a long moment, no one moved. The master and the enslaved stared at each other across an unbridgeable gulf that had always existed but was only now becoming visible. Then Cornelius Ashcroft opened his mouth to shout, to command, to reassert the order he believed God himself had ordained. But the shadows reached the house first. They poured across the manicured lawn like spilled ink, flowing up the white columns, seeping through windows and under doors. Inside the house, someone began to scream. Not Cornelius, a woman's voice, high and terrified, coming from the servants' wing. "Mercy," Delilah whispered. But when Josiah turned to look at the main house, at the shadows crawling across its facade like insects, he knew it wasn't Mercy screaming. Mercy was doing something else entirely. In an upstairs window, a small figure appeared, a girl in a torn dress, her face tilted at an angle that suggested her neck was broken. She shouldn't have been able to stand. She shouldn't have been able to move. But she pressed her hands against the glass and smiled. Her teeth were too many, and far too sharp. "Sweet Jesus," Silas breathed, making the sign of the cross. "Jesus ain't here tonight," Delilah said, and her voice carried a strange mixture of grief and satisfaction. "We called something else when we decided enough was enough. Something that's been waiting a long, long time." Josiah felt the truth of her words in his bones. The revolt wasn't just against the Ashcrofts, it wasn't just against slavery and suffering and subjugation. It was against the very fabric of reality that had permitted such things to exist. And when you tear reality, something from the other side comes through. The fire spread to the main house's kitchen wing. Inside, the screaming intensified, multiple voices now, overlapping, some human and some decidedly not. "What have we done?" Josiah whispered. No one answered him. Because they all knew, in the deepest parts of themselves where truth lives unspoken, that they had done what had to be done. And that what had to be done would exact a price none of them had anticipated paying. The bell continued to ring, marking time for the damned, as the Ashcroft estate began its descent into a darkness far deeper than any night. Cornelius Ashcroft had built his fortune on the principle that God favored the strong and punished the weak. He had inherited 200 acres and 30 slaves from his father, and through shrewd management, which is to say, brutal efficiency, had expanded his holdings to 800 acres and 147 souls bound to his service. He had done this by understanding a simple truth: fear, properly applied, was more valuable than any crop. But fear, he was learning as he descended the grand staircase in his nightshirt, was a currency that could be devalued. The house felt wrong. He'd sensed it the moment the screaming woke him, not the quality of the screams themselves, though those were terrible enough, but the way they seemed to echo in spaces that shouldn't echo, the way shadows pooled in corners too thickly, defying the lamplight. The air itself tasted of smoke and something else, something that made the back of his throat burn with sensations he had no words for. "Lavinia," he bellowed up the stairs, but his wife didn't answer. She was barricaded in their chambers. He'd heard her shoving furniture against the door after he'd left, and heard her prayers rising like smoke through the keyhole. Let her pray. Prayers were for women and cowards. Cornelius Ashcroft had built an empire with his own two hands, and he would defend it the same way. He reached the entrance hall just as the front door exploded inward. Josiah Creed entered first, the pitchfork in his hand slick with Augustus Thorne's blood. Behind him came a tide of faces Cornelius had seen every day for years but had never truly looked at: Delilah, Silas, Temperance, Jonah, Ruth, Solomon, Ezekiel, dozens more whose names he'd never bothered to learn. They filled his entrance hall like flood water, like a plague, like judgment itself made flesh. "Get out of my house." Cornelius's voice was steel, even as his hands trembled. "I'll give you one chance to turn around and accept your punishment like." "Like what?" Josiah's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "Like animals. Like property. Like things that don't feel pain or fear or rage." "You are my property," Cornelius snarled. "I own you. I own your labor, your children, your very lives. That's the law. That's God's will. That's..." "Where's Beauregard?" The question came from the back of the crowd, from a girl barely visible in the press of bodies. It took Cornelius a moment to recognize her, the clumsy one, the one his son had corrected last week. What was her name? Charity? Mercy? She pushed forward through the crowd, and when she stepped into the lamplight, Cornelius's certainty faltered. Her face was wrong. The injuries Beauregard had inflicted, the split lip, the blackened eye, the swollen jaw, had somehow gotten worse instead of healing. Her left cheek sagged as if the bone beneath had turned to jelly. Her right eye bulged from its socket, veined with red and something darker. When she smiled, her teeth were stained black with old blood. "Where is he?" Mercy asked again, and her voice was layered, as if multiple people were speaking through her mouth at once. "Where is the young master who taught me my place?" "Upstairs," Cornelius said automatically, then cursed himself for answering. "But you touch him, and I swear to God." God. Delilah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You want to talk about God now? After 40 years of using his name to justify every cruelty, every separation, every lash of the whip? Where was God when my daughter was sold south? Where was God when my son was gelded for looking at a white woman? Where was your merciful God then, Master Ashcroft? Cornelius opened his mouth to answer, to explain the natural order, to quote the scripture that justified his world. But the words died in his throat. Because the shadows in his entrance hall were moving. They peeled away from walls and furniture, flowing across the marble floor like liquid darkness. They climbed the legs of chairs and wrapped around the chandelier crystals, dimming the lamplight until the hall fell into a twilight that had never existed in nature. And in that twilight, Cornelius saw things that made his bladder release, warm urine streaming down his legs and pooling at his feet. The shadows had faces. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Every slave who had ever died on Ashcroft land, going back to his grandfather's time. They pressed against reality like hands against a membrane, trying to push through, their mouths open in silent screams or accusations or prayers that would never be answered. Sweet merciful Christ, Cornelius whispered. No mercy here, Mercy said, and her smile widened until it split her cheeks. Not tonight. She started up the stairs. Others followed, Silas with a kitchen knife, Temperance with a fireplace poker, Jonah with a length of chain that had once bound his own ankle. They climbed toward the second floor where Beauregard's chambers waited, and Cornelius could do nothing but watch them go. Because Josiah's pitchfork was pressed against his chest, the tines dimpled his nightshirt, ready to punch through to his heart with the smallest pressure. You'll die for this, Cornelius said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The militia will come. The law will. The law. Josiah's laugh was bitter. Your law. The law that says I'm 3/5 of a person. The law that says my children can be sold like cattle. The law that says you can beat me, work me to death, rape my wife, and face no consequences. He pressed the pitchfork harder, drawing blood. Tonight, we make our own law. From upstairs came the sound of a door being battered down, then Beauregard's voice raised in outrage that quickly transformed to terror. His screams echoed through the house, and with each cry, the shadows grew darker, more solid, more hungry. In the dining room, the long table where Ashcrofts had eaten while slaves served began to crack down its center, the wood splitting as if something underneath was trying to emerge. In the parlor, the piano played itself, a discordant melody that sounded like screaming set to music. In the library, books flew from shelves and pages tore themselves free, swirling through the air like a blizzard of words, all the laws and justifications and biblical interpretations that had built this world of suffering, reduced now to confetti. Delilah walked to the grand mirror in the entrance hall, the one imported from Paris at tremendous expense. She looked at her reflection, an old woman, worn down by decades of invisible labor, her youth stolen, her dignity stripped, her very humanity questioned by people who knew nothing of humanity. Then she picked up a marble bust of Cornelius's father and drove it through the glass. The mirror shattered, and for just a moment, in the fragments, Cornelius saw not Delilah's reflection but something else. A young woman, strong and proud, wearing robes of a style not seen for centuries. An African queen, perhaps, or a priestess, before the ships came and the chains were forged. A woman who knew her worth and would have died rather than bow. That woman smiled at Cornelius from the broken glass, and then the fragments fell, and there was only Delilah again, old and bent and filled with a rage that had fermented into something darker than hate. Everything you built, she said quietly, was built on our backs. Our blood. Our children. Our souls. And tonight, we're taking it all back. From upstairs, Beauregard's screams reached a crescendo, then cut off abruptly. In the silence that followed, something worse than screaming filled the void, wet sounds, tearing sounds, the enthusiastic work of people who had been denied satisfaction for too long. Cornelius closed his eyes. God forgive you all. God forgive us. Josiah's voice was cold as January frost. We're not the ones who need forgiving. He pulled the pitchfork back, preparing to strike, and in that moment Cornelius Ashcroft saw his death approaching with absolute clarity. But before the blow could land, a voice rang out from the top of the stairs. Stop. Everyone froze. Even the shadows seemed to pause in their crawling. At the top of the grand staircase stood a woman Cornelius had never seen before, though her face was somehow familiar. She wore the tattered remains of a slave's dress, but she stood like royalty. Her skin was the deep brown of polished mahogany, her hair was silver white despite her apparent youth, and her eyes were completely black, no whites, no iris, just pools of darkness that reflected the lamplight like mirrors. "This one lives," she said, gesturing at Cornelius. "For now. He needs to see what comes next. He needs to witness. He needs to understand that the world he knew is ending, and that its ending is both his judgment and his mercy." "Who?" Josiah started, but the woman descended the stairs, and as she moved, the shadows bowed before her like courtiers before a queen. "I was the first," she said. "The first soul to die on this land after it was stolen and claimed and built upon with blood. I was 15. The old master, this one's grandfather, used me as he pleased, then killed me when I threatened to tell his wife. He buried me in the foundation of this house." She smiled, and her teeth were white as bone. "I've been waiting underneath, gathering the others as they come. Every murdered child. Every broken mother. Every man worked to death. We've all been waiting, pressed down into the soil, becoming part of the earth itself." She reached Cornelius and placed one hand on his face. Where she touched him, his skin went gray, then black, as if gangrene was spreading from her fingers. "Tonight, the earth vomits us back up," she whispered. "And we are hungry." Cornelius tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. The darkness was spreading from where she touched him, racing across his flesh like fire, turning him to living stone. He could feel it, feel his body becoming heavy, immobile, his blood slowing in his veins like cold molasses. "Let him watch," the woman said to Josiah. "Let him stand here and witness what he created. Let him see every moment of what comes next, unable to move, unable to help, unable to do anything but understand." She removed her hand. Cornelius stood frozen, a statue of flesh and terror, his eyes the only part of him still capable of movement. They darted wildly, taking in the scene around him, his home being torn apart, his world collapsing, his certainty shattered. Outside, the fire had spread to the guest house. Inside, the slaves moved through the manor like a tide, pulling down curtains, smashing furniture, destroying everything they'd been forced to maintain with such careful precision. But it wasn't random vandalism. There was a purpose to it, a ritual quality, as if they were exorcising the house of decades of accumulated suffering. In the parlor, Ruth found a ledger where Cornelius recorded his human property, names, ages, prices paid, children born, slaves sold. She carried it to the fireplace and fed it to the flames, page by page, watching names turn to ash and smoke. In the dining room, Solomon took the silver that slaves had polished until it gleamed, service after service, year after year. He melted it in a cook pot over the dining room fireplace, then poured the molten metal onto the Persian carpet, watching it burn and bubble and turn to ruin. In the study, Temperance found Cornelius's collection of whips, 6 different varieties, each designed for maximum pain with minimum permanent damage, because damaged property lost value. She took them outside and threw them into the burning stable, watching them curl and blacken and disappear into flame. And upstairs, in Beauregard's chambers, Mercy stood over what remained of the master's son. The others had left her alone with him at the end, sensing that she had earned the right to privacy for whatever came next. The sounds that had come from that room had made even the hardest among them uncomfortable. But now silence reigned, and Mercy emerged into the hallway, her dress soaked with blood that wasn't all hers. She walked slowly, carefully, as if learning how to use her body again. When she reached the stairs and began to descend, Cornelius saw that her face had changed again. The injuries were gone. She looked almost normal, almost human, except for her eyes, those had gone completely black, like the woman who had cursed him into immobility. "He begged," Mercy announced to the gathered slaves below. "At the end. He begged and pleaded and promised he'd never hurt anyone again. He cried for his mother." She paused on the landing, backlit by lamplight that made her seem larger than her small frame. "I wonder if that's how his victims felt. I wonder if they begged too." No one answered. The question needed no answer. Delilah moved to stand beside Josiah, both of them looking at Cornelius's frozen form. "What do we do with him?" "Leave him," Josiah said. "Let him watch us walk away free. Let him stand here while his house burns around him. Let him be a monument to his own failure. But the woman with silver hair and black eyes shook her head. No. He has a purpose yet. When the militia comes, and they will come, they'll need to see what happened here. They'll need to understand that this isn't just a slave revolt. This is something older, something deeper. This is the land itself rejecting what was built upon it. She turned to address them all, her voice carrying to every corner of the house. We cannot stay here. What we've awakened tonight, what I've brought through, it doesn't distinguish between guilty and innocent. It only knows hunger and rage and the debt owed. If we remain, it will consume us too. Where do we go? Silas asked. They'll hunt us. We're in Virginia. They'll hunt us until we're all dead or back in chains. Then we make for the north, Delilah said firmly. We move fast, move quiet, and we survive. We've done the impossible already tonight. We can do it again. But even as she spoke, the windows began to crack. Not from heat or pressure, but spontaneously, spiderwebbing with fractures that spread like veins. Through the broken glass, tendrils of smoke from the burning outbuildings reached inside, and within that smoke, faces appeared and dissolved, an endless parade of the dead demanding recognition. We need to go now, Josiah said. Gather what you can carry, food, weapons, warm clothes. We leave in 10 minutes. They scattered to obey, moving through the house with purpose, taking what they needed and nothing more. They weren't looters. They were survivors claiming the tools of their survival. Cornelius watched them go, his eyes the only part of him capable of expressing his helpless fury. He watched them strip his house of provisions. He watched them arm themselves with his weapons. He watched them walk out his front door as free men and women, something he'd spent his life ensuring they would never be. And he watched the woman with silver hair approach him one final time. You'll stand here until someone finds you, she said softly, almost gently. Days, perhaps. Maybe longer. You'll feel everything, thirst, hunger, the fire's heat if it spreads this far. You'll feel it all but be unable to move, unable to cry out, unable to do anything but experience the suffering you've inflicted on others. Consider it an education. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Cornelius? The shadows? They're going to keep you company. They'll show you things. Memories of everyone who suffered here. You'll live through each one, feel each lash of the whip, each separation of families, each indignity and cruelty. By the time someone finds you, you'll have lived 1,000 lifetimes of suffering. She smiled. That's mercy. Death would be kinder. Then she was gone, following the others out into the night, leaving Cornelius alone with his frozen scream and the shadows that were already beginning to whisper secrets he didn't want to know. Outside, the freed slaves gathered in the yard, faces lit by the burning buildings. Some wept. Some laughed. Most stood in numb shock at what they'd done, what they'd become, what they'd unleashed. Josiah looked back at the manor, at the windows beginning to glow with internal fire, at the monument to oppression starting to consume itself. He felt no triumph. Only a terrible, hollow certainty that tonight had changed them all in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Move out, he said quietly. Stay together. Watch for each other. And whatever happens next, remember, we're human. No matter what anyone says, no matter what we had to become tonight, we're human. They began to walk, a column of souls moving toward an uncertain freedom, leaving behind the burning wreckage of the only world they'd ever known. Behind them, the Ashcroft manor began its final collapse, flames shooting through windows, walls cracking, the roof sagging inward. And in those flames, if one looked carefully, one could see shapes dancing, celebrating or mourning, it was impossible to say. The reckoning had spread beyond the hayloft, beyond the stables, beyond even the manor house itself. It had spread into the very soil of Virginia, into the bones of the South, into the future that was even now being written in ash and blood and the terrible price of freedom stolen and freedom reclaimed. The horror is intensifying, and we're only halfway through this nightmare. If you're captivated by this dark tale, subscribe now and drop a comment. What do you think about the supernatural elements entering the story? Are Josiah and the others truly free, or have they traded one horror for another? Share your thoughts below, and let's continue deeper into the darkness. Lavinia Ashcroft had spent 32 years perfecting the art of not seeing. She had mastered the delicate skill of looking through the scars on a servant's back, of hearing screams as if they were birdsong, of smelling blood as if it were roses. She had built an entire life on the foundation of willful blindness, and that foundation was crumbling beneath her feet. In her chamber, barricaded behind an armoire and a writing desk and 2 chairs stacked against the door, Lavinia pressed her hands over her ears and prayed. But God seemed as absent tonight as he had been during every atrocity she'd witnessed and ignored. The house was screaming. That was the only way to describe the sounds filtering through walls that suddenly seemed as thin as paper. Not just human screams, though those were terrible enough, but the screams of wood twisting, of glass shattering, of the very structure itself crying out in agony as it was torn apart from within. And underneath it all, whispers. Hundreds of overlapping voices speaking words she couldn't quite understand but felt in her bones. "Please," Lavinia whimpered, clutching her rosary until the beads cut into her palms. "Please, Father in heaven, deliver me from." The mirror on her vanity cracked. Not shattered, just split cleanly down the middle, and in that division, Lavinia saw not her own reflection but someone else's. A young woman, perhaps 20, with skin like polished ebony and eyes that held depths of sorrow Lavinia had never permitted herself to acknowledge. "Do you know me?" the reflection asked, though the lips in the mirror didn't move in sync with the words. Lavinia shook her head mutely. "You should." The reflection smiled, sad and terrible. "I raised your daughter. I nursed her when she was sick. I sang her to sleep when she had nightmares. I taught her to read before you even noticed she'd grown old enough for letters." "Patience," Lavinia breathed, the name surfacing from memory like a drowning body. "You were Patience." "I was." The reflection's smile widened, revealing too many teeth. "Until your husband decided my own daughter was old enough to sell. She was 8 years old, Mistress Ashcroft. 8. And when I begged him not to separate us, he had me whipped unconscious. Do you remember that?" Lavinia did remember. She'd heard the commotion from the garden, and had seen Patience's broken body carried past her window. She'd thought, briefly, that it was unfortunate. Then she'd returned to her embroidery. "I'm sorry," Lavinia whispered. "No." The reflection's voice hardened. "You're not sorry. You're scared. There's a difference." The mirror exploded outward, shards flying across the room. Lavinia screamed and ducked, feeling glass slice across her arms and face. When she looked up, Patience stood in her chamber, not a reflection, not a ghost, but something solid and present and wrong. She wore the same dress she died in, still stained with blood from the whipping that had killed her 3 weeks later from infection. "How?" Lavinia started. "The door between worlds is open tonight," Patience said, taking a step closer. "What your people awakened when they finally broke, it opened gates that should have stayed closed. And we who died here, we've been waiting on the other side. Watching. Remembering. Accounting." The barricade against the door began to move, furniture sliding aside as if pushed by invisible hands. Lavinia scrambled backward until her spine hit the wall. "Please, I never wanted. You never stopped it either." Another figure emerged through the door, this one a man Lavinia barely recognized. He'd worked in the fields, and died of heatstroke last summer. What was his name? She'd never learned it. "You had the power to speak. To intervene. To show mercy. And you chose silence. I was powerless." Lavinia's voice rose to a shriek. "I was just a wife, just a woman, I had no say in. You had everything." A third figure appeared, and another, until Lavinia's chamber filled with the dead. They crowded around her bed, their eyes reflecting the firelight from outside, their wounds still fresh despite months or years in the ground. "You had comfort while we had pain. You had full bellies while we starved. You had agency, choice, the luxury of turning away. We had nothing." The walls began to weep. Thick, dark liquid seeped from the floral wallpaper, running down in rivulets that stained the cream paint. It smelled of iron and rot and something older, something that had been buried deep beneath the manor's foundation. "This house is built on us," Patience said, watching the walls bleed. "Our bodies, our labor, our suffering. We're in every brick, every board, every nail. And tonight, we're coming out." The floor buckled. Lavinia felt the wood beneath her feet ripple like water, and for a moment, she saw through it, saw the dark earth below, saw the bones buried there, dozens of unmarked graves from decades of callous disposal. Saw the faces of children who'd died of fever, men who'd been beaten to death, women who'd birthed babies that were sold before they could be named. Dear God, Lavinia sobbed. I didn't know. I didn't know there were so many. You didn't want to know. Patience knelt beside Lavinia, and where her hand touched the older woman's arm, the flesh went cold. That's the difference between ignorance and innocence. You chose not to see. Every day, every moment, you chose comfort over conscience. From downstairs came the sound of the others leaving, their footsteps echoing through the entrance hall. Lavinia heard Josiah's voice giving orders, heard the front door opening, heard freedom walking out of her home while she remained trapped in her own private hell. Why don't you kill me? Lavinia asked, because death seemed preferable to this, to seeing, finally, what she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. If you hate me so much, why not end it? Patience tilted her head, considering. Because death is an escape. And you don't get to escape. You get to live. You get to remember. Every time you close your eyes, you'll see us. Every time you sleep, you'll dream our dreams. You'll carry us with you for whatever time you have left, and when you finally die, you'll answer to something far worse than us. The dead began to fade, dissolving like smoke, but their whispers remained, echoing in the corners of Lavinia's mind where they would live forever. Patience was last to go, her form growing transparent, her eyes the last to disappear. Remember us, she said. Remember that we were human. That we suffered. That we mattered. Remember, even though it destroys you. Then she was gone, and Lavinia was alone in her ruined chamber, surrounded by broken furniture and bleeding walls and the terrible, crushing weight of acknowledgement. She could hear her husband downstairs, or what remained of him, standing frozen in the entrance hall, a monument to his own cruelty. The manor groaned around her, settling into its death throes. Fire had reached the west wing, consuming the library and the parlor, moving inexorably toward the bedroom chambers. Soon, the entire structure would collapse, taking with it all evidence of the Ashcrofts' prosperity and the suffering that had built it. Lavinia crawled to her window and looked out at the grounds. The freed slaves were disappearing into the tree line, following Josiah toward whatever uncertain future awaited them. Behind them, the estate burned like a funeral pyre, orange flames reaching toward a sky choked with smoke and stars that seemed to watch with cold indifference. I'm sorry, Lavinia whispered again, though no one remained to hear her. God forgive me, I'm so sorry. But the house had no forgiveness to offer. It only had truth, brutal, unvarnished truth that could no longer be ignored or prettied up or explained away with scripture and social order. The truth that every comfort she'd enjoyed had been stolen from human beings who deserved better. The truth that her silence had been complicated. The truth that she had spent her life as a monster's wife and had never once tried to be anything else. The ceiling above her cracked. Embers drifted down like snow, catching on her dress, on her hair, on the bed where she'd slept peacefully while others screamed in the night. Lavinia didn't move. She simply sat there, watching the flames come closer, waiting for the manor to complete its collapse. She would survive this night, the fire would miss her wing by mere feet, the structure would hold just long enough for rescue to arrive. But Patience was right. Death would have been kinder. Lavinia Ashcroft would live to see the sunrise, and every sunrise after, and she would spend the rest of her days haunted by the truth she could no longer unsee. The manor screamed its final scream as the roof caved in, taking with it 30 years of careful cultivation, of social prestige, of a life built on the fiction that some human beings were worth more than others. And in the ashes that rained down like judgment, one could almost see faces, hundreds of them, thousands, all the unnamed and unremembered dead of the South, finally visible, finally real, finally impossible to ignore. The psychological horror is reaching its peak. If you're still with us on this dark journey, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, do you think Lavinia deserved mercy? What about the supernatural forces that have been unleashed? Drop your thoughts below as we push toward the climax. Beauregard Ashcroft had always believed himself invincible. At 23, he had never faced a consequence he couldn't charm or buy his way out of, had never encountered resistance he couldn't break with his fists or his father's influence. He was handsome, wealthy, educated at the finest institutions Virginia could offer, and utterly convinced of his right to take whatever he wanted from a world designed to give him everything. Tonight, the world was taking back its gifts with interest. He'd woken to smoke and screaming, had stumbled from his bed still drunk from the evening's brandy, had opened his door to find the hallway filled with figures that shouldn't have been inside the house. Slaves. His slaves. Standing in his home with weapons in their hands and something terrible in their eyes. Beauregard had run. He crashed through the servants' entrance at the back of the manor, nearly falling down the narrow stairs, his silk nightshirt catching on rough wood. Behind him, he could hear footsteps, not running, but walking with terrible purpose, the sound of people who knew their prey had nowhere to go. The guest house. If he could reach it, barricade himself inside, he could survive until the militia arrived. His new bride Constance was there, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the nightmare unfolding in the main house. She would help him. Together they would endure this madness until order was restored. The night air hit him like a physical blow, thick with smoke and the smell of burning hay and something else, something that reminded him of the slaughterhouse in town. He ran across the lawn, dew soaking through his slippers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, the manor blazed like the mouth of hell, flames shooting from windows, smoke pouring from the roof. He didn't look back. Didn't see Josiah and the others emerge from the servants' entrance, didn't see the way they moved through the darkness like wolves on a scent. Didn't see Mercy at the front of the group, her ruined face twisted into something that might have been a smile. The guest house loomed before him, a small cottage at the edge of the property where he and Constance had been staying while their own manor was being built on the eastern parcel. Beauregard reached the door, fumbled with the latch, burst inside and slammed it shut behind him. "Constance," he shouted, throwing the bolt and dragging a chair against the door. "Constance, wake up. We're under attack." Silence answered him. The cottage was dark, no candles lit, no fire in the hearth despite the evening chill. Beauregard felt his way through the sitting room toward the bedroom, hands outstretched, heart hammering against his ribs. "Constance." The bedroom door was open. Moonlight filtered through the window, painting everything in shades of silver and black. And there, in the bed, was his wife. She wasn't sleeping. Constance Fairweather Ashcroft sat upright against the headboard, her eyes open and glassy, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore her nightgown, her blonde hair was perfectly arranged, and her throat was cut from ear to ear. Blood had soaked the bedclothes, the mattress, pooling on the floor in a dark mirror that reflected nothing. Beauregard's scream caught in his throat, emerging as a strangled whimper. No. No, no, no. She never woke up. The voice came from the corner of the room. Beauregard spun, and there was Mercy, sitting in the reading chair as if she belonged there. How had she gotten in? He'd locked the door, he'd barricaded it, she couldn't possibly. "I came in through the window," Mercy said, answering his unspoken question. "Hours ago. While you were still drinking yourself stupid in the main house. I sat here and watched her sleep. She was very beautiful. Very peaceful. I almost didn't want to disturb her. You killed her." Beauregard's voice rose to a shriek. "You murdered my wife. She married a monster." Mercy stood, and Beauregard saw that she held a straight razor, Constance's blood still wet on the blade. That makes her complicit. That makes her part of the system that permits monsters to exist. She was innocent. She never hurt anyone, she. "Neither had I," Mercy interrupted quietly. "Until you beat me half to death for dropping a glass. Tell me, Master Beauregard, did I deserve that? Did my clumsiness warrant broken ribs and a shattered jaw? Did my inexperience justify your rage?" Beauregard backed toward the door, but before he could reach it, it exploded inward. The barricade he'd erected might as well have been made of paper. Josiah entered first, pitchfork still in hand, followed by Silas, Temperance, and Jonah. They filled the small cottage, their faces grim in the moonlight. "Please," Beauregard said, and he hated the pleading tone in his voice, and hated the way fear made him small. "Please, I'll leave. I'll go north, I'll never come back, I'll." "Beg," Mercy said. "That's good. Beg like I begged. Cry like I cried. Let me see you reduced to nothing, the way you reduced me." Beauregard dropped to his knees. Tears streamed down his face, snot ran from his nose. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. I was drunk, I was angry, I didn't mean." "You meant every blow," Josiah said coldly. "You enjoyed it. I saw your face. You smiled while you beat her. The cottage began to change. The walls rippled like water, the floor tilted at impossible angles, and suddenly they weren't in the guest house anymore. They were in the entrance hall of the main manor, and it was a week ago, and Mercy was carrying a silver tray, and the crystal glass was sliding toward the edge. Beauregard watched himself catch it. Watched himself smile that particular smile. Watched himself strike the girl again and again while his past self felt nothing but satisfaction. No, Beauregard whispered. This isn't real. This is a nightmare. I'm still asleep, The scene shifted. Now he was in the stables, 3 years ago, beating a stable boy named Marcus who had accidentally left a gate open. The boy was 14, small for his age, and Beauregard's riding crop split the skin of his back open in long red lines. Shift again. The quarters, 5 years passed. A woman named Sarah who had refused his advances. He'd had her whipped publicly, 20 lashes, then visited her cabin that night anyway. Her scream still echoed in this phantom memory. Shift again. And again. And again. A parade of cruelty spanning years, faces and names Beauregard had forgotten as soon as the violence ended, moments he'd never thought about twice now forced before his eyes in excruciating detail. Make it stop, he sobbed. Please, God, make it stop. God isn't listening, Mercy said. She stood before him now, and her face was no longer human. It had become something else, something ancient and pitiless, something that had crawled up from the blood-soaked soil to witness this reckoning. But we are. All of us. Every person you hurt. We're all here now. The cottage is filled with ghosts. Marcus was there, his back still bleeding. Sarah stood beside him, her face hollow with remembered horror. Dozens more crowded in, pressing close, their wounds fresh, their eyes accusing. What do you want? Beauregard screamed. What do you want from me? Acknowledgement, Josiah said. We want you to see us. Really see us. Not as property or tools or objects for your rage. As people. As human beings who suffered at your hands. I see you. I see you all. Please. Mercy knelt before him, her black eyes boring into his. Do you truly? Or are you just saying what you think will save you? Beauregard opened his mouth to lie, to say whatever would end this nightmare, but the words wouldn't come. Because in that moment, looking into Mercy's inhuman eyes, seeing the ghosts crowding around him, feeling the weight of his own actions pressing down like a physical force, he finally understood. They weren't going to let him live. Please, he whispered one last time, but the word was ash in his mouth. Mercy raised the razor. You beat me until I couldn't stand. Do you remember how that felt? How powerless I was. How I knew I couldn't stop you, couldn't fight back, couldn't do anything but endure. Yes, Beauregard breathed. Good. Her smile was terrible and sad and utterly without mercy. Now you know how all of us felt. Every day of our lives. Powerless in the face of cruelty we didn't deserve. The razor descended. What happened next took a long time. The others participated, each taking their turn, each making him understand in the most visceral way possible what he had made them feel. They didn't rush. They didn't show mercy when he begged for it. They didn't stop when he promised to change, to be better, to repent. Because Beauregard Ashcroft had spent 23 years learning that actions had no consequences for men like him. And in his last hour, he learned the truth, consequences were merely deferred, not eliminated. They accumulated interest. And when payment finally came due, it came with the weight of every unpaid debt behind it. The moon had moved a hand's width across the sky by the time it was finished. The cottage was silent except for the drip of blood and the ragged breathing of people who had done things they could never undo. Josiah looked down at what remained of Beauregard Ashcroft and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not horror, not regret. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where emotions should have been. It's done, he said quietly. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt it, the change in the air, the thickening of shadows, the sense that something was watching them with interest. The woman with silver hair had been right. They'd opened a door tonight, and what came through wasn't content with just vengeance. It wanted more. The shadows in the cottage's corners began to move, reaching toward the living as they had reached toward the dead, indiscriminate in their hunger. "We need to leave," Silas said, his voice shaking. "Now. Something's wrong. Something's." The cottage door slammed open. But it wasn't more slaves seeking vengeance. It was something else, something made of smoke and shadow and the screams of the unavenged. It flowed into the room like flood water, and where it touched, flesh went gray and cold. "Run!" Josiah shouted. They fled into the night, leaving Beauregard's body behind, leaving the cottage to whatever had come to claim it. Behind them, the structure collapsed inward, consumed not by fire but by something darker, something that had been fed too well and wanted more. As they ran toward the others gathering at the tree line, Josiah realized with horror that their revolt had succeeded. But they'd paid a price none of them had anticipated. They'd unleashed something that wouldn't stop with the Ashcrofts. It would consume them all before dawn. The forest should have been a sanctuary. For generations, slaves had whispered about the woods beyond the Ashcroft property, how they stretched north toward freedom, how runaways had disappeared into those trees and occasionally, miraculously, made it to places where chains had no meaning. But as Josiah led the survivors deeper into the darkness between the pines, he realized the forest was no longer offering escape. It was holding them prisoner. They'd been walking for an hour, maybe more, time had become slippery, unreliable, and yet the burning manor remained visible through the trees, always the same distance away no matter how far they traveled. The smoke column should have receded behind them. Instead, it followed like a shepherd's crook, curving overhead, boxing them in. "We're going in circles," Delilah said, her voice tight with the kind of fear that came from understanding rather than ignorance. "The path keeps looping back." Josiah stopped, holding up his hand to halt the group behind him. 37 souls had made it this far, 37 out of the 147 who had lived on the Ashcroft estate. Some had stayed behind, too frightened to run. Some had died in the violence. And some. Josiah didn't want to think about what had happened to some of them. Temperance collapsed against a tree trunk, breathing hard. Blood stained her dress, whose blood, Josiah couldn't say. Maybe Beauregard's. Maybe Augustus's. Maybe her own, seeping from wounds she'd stopped noticing. "We can't keep walking anywhere," she gasped. "We need to rest. We need to." A scream cut through the night. It came from the back of their column, where Jonah had been helping his wife Ruth walk. She was 8 months pregnant, her belly swollen with a child who would be born free or not at all. Josiah ran toward the sound, pitchfork raised, and found Jonah standing alone. Ruth was gone. "She was right here," Jonah said, spinning in circles, his eyes wild. "She was right beside me, I was holding her hand, and then," he looked at his empty palm as if it had betrayed him. "She was here." The forest was silent. No footsteps crashing through undergrowth, no branches breaking, no sounds of struggle. Ruth had simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next. "Ruth!" Jonah shouted into the darkness. "Ruth!" The forest swallowed his voice without echo. "We need to keep moving," Silas said, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. "Standing still won't help her. Moving doesn't help either." Jonah's voice cracked. "We're trapped. Whatever we unleashed back there, it's not finished with us. It won't let us leave." As if in confirmation, the trees around them began to bleed. Dark liquid seeped from the bark, running down trunks in thick rivulets that pooled at the roots. It smelled of copper and decay and the particular stench of the slave quarters after a whipping, blood and fear and suffering made tangible. The liquid spread across the forest floor, creeping toward them like something alive. "Back!" Delilah shouted. "Don't let it touch you." They retreated, but the bleeding trees surrounded them on all sides. The liquid flowed together, forming a circle that contracted slowly, inexorably, forcing them closer together. In the moonlight filtering through the canopy, the blood, for what else could it be, reflected their faces back at them, distorted and wrong. Mercy stood at the circle's edge, staring down at her reflection. Her face in the blood was changing, aging rapidly, skin sagging and graying and finally rotting away until only the skull remained. She looked up at the others with those impossible black eyes. "It's showing us what we are," she said quietly. "What we've become." "We're survivors," Josiah said firmly. We did what we had to do. We're not monsters. Aren't we? The woman with silver hair stepped from behind a tree as if she'd been there all along, waiting for this moment. You killed tonight. You butchered. You enjoyed it, admit it. Some of you enjoyed it very much. Silas looked away, and that was admission enough. We had cause, Delilah said, but her voice wavered. They enslaved us. Beat us. Murdered us. We had every right. Rights. The silver-haired woman laughed, and it was the saddest sound Josiah had ever heard. You think what happened tonight was about rights? About justice? Oh, children. What you did tonight was older than justice. Older than law. You opened the door to something primal, something that existed before humans learned to pretend they were civilized. The blood circle contracted further. They stood shoulder to shoulder now, nowhere left to retreat. You called to the rage that sleeps in soil soaked with suffering, the woman continued. You woke the fury that accumulates in places where atrocities become routine. And that fury answered. But here's what you didn't understand, it doesn't distinguish. It doesn't care who's guilty and who's innocent. It only knows hunger and debt, and the debt is never fully paid. What are you? Josiah asked, though part of him already knew. I'm the first, she said again, as she had in the manor. The first to be murdered on this land. But I'm also every woman who came after, every child, every man. We're all here, compressed into this shape, this avatar of accumulated suffering. And we want. She paused, tilting her head as if listening to voices only she could hear. We want everything, she finished. We want the world unmade and rebuilt. We want the guilty to suffer and the innocent to understand that innocence is a luxury the damned can't afford. We want. Enough. Delilah stepped forward, facing the silver-haired woman with a defiance that made Josiah's heart ache. We've suffered. We've died. We've been broken and unmade and scattered to nothing. But we're still here. Still human. Still capable of choosing mercy even when none was shown to us. The woman's black eyes fixed on Delilah. You think mercy will save you? No. Delilah's voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. But it might save who we are. It might let us be free in truth, not just in body. You want to consume us, make us extensions of your rage? We won't let you. We've been property long enough. We won't be your property either. For a long moment, nothing moved. The blood on the ground ceased its creeping advance. The trees stopped bleeding. Even the smoke column rising from the distant manor seemed to pause mid-billow. Then the silver-haired woman smiled. There it is, she said softly. The strength that survives everything. The humanity that persists even in hell. She looked at each of them in turn. You're right. I can't take that from you. No one can. Not even me. The blood circle began to recede, flowing back toward the trees, seeping into the earth. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on them lifted slightly, though it didn't disappear entirely. But understand this, the woman said. What you started tonight will echo for generations. The violence you unleashed will spread beyond this plantation, beyond Virginia, beyond anything you can imagine. You've shown that the enslaved can fight back, can win, can make their oppressors bleed. That knowledge will spread like fire, and it will be met with fire in return. The suffering that comes will make what happened tonight seem like mercy. Josiah felt the truth of her words settle into his bones. History was a river, and they'd just thrown a boulder into its flow. The ripples would spread, changing everything, and the change would be written in blood. We know, he said quietly. We always knew. But we chose freedom anyway. Whatever comes, we'll face it free. The woman nodded slowly. Then go. The forest will release you now. Head north. Some of you will make it. Some won't. That's the price of the door you opened. She began to fade, her form dissolving into the moonlight and shadow. But before she disappeared entirely, she looked at Mercy. You, child. You carry too much of me with you. That rage, that darkness, it'll consume you if you let it. Mercy's black eyes met hers without flinching. Maybe. But it kept me alive tonight. I'll carry it as long as I need to. The woman smiled one last time, sad and proud and terrible. Then carry it north to freedom. Become something new. But remember, revenge is a meal that poisons everyone who eats it, even when the hunger was justified. Then she was gone, and they were alone in the forest with only the distant glow of the burning manor to light their way. Move out, Josiah said, and this time, when they walked, the forest let them pass. They emerged from the tree line as dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Behind them, the Ashcroft estate was a smoking ruin, nothing left but charred timbers and ash and the memories of everyone who had suffered there. Ahead lay uncertainty, militias, slave catchers, a country that would hunt them until they were dead or recaptured. But for now, in this moment between darkness and light, they were free. Ruth stumbled from the forest half an hour later, confused and unharmed, with no memory of where she'd been. Jonah wept as he held her, and no one questioned the mercy that had returned her. They'd learned that some things were beyond understanding. As they walked north toward the rising sun, Delilah fell into step beside Josiah. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked. Josiah looked back one last time at the smoke rising from the ruins of the only home he'd ever known. In that smoke, he could still see faces, some accusatory, some grateful, all transformed by what had happened in the burning hour. "Some of us will," he said. "That'll have to be enough." They walked on, a column of freed souls carrying their trauma and their triumph in equal measure. Behind them, in the ruins of the Ashcroft estate, Cornelia still stood frozen, a monument to the world that was ending. Lavinia sat in her chamber, learning to live with sight she could no longer unseen. And in the ashes, something ancient settled back into the soil, sated for now but never satisfied, waiting for the next time suffering accumulated enough to call it forth. The Ashcroft servants' revolt had ended. But the ripples were just beginning to spread. And in Virginia, 1861, as the country stood on the precipice of war, one burning manor joined countless other fires, all of them lit by people who had finally decided that death was preferable to another day in chains. The dawn came red as blood, promising nothing but the certainty that nothing would ever be the same. And so ends our journey into the darkness of the Ashcroft estate. If this story left you shaken, haunted, or thinking deeply about the horrors of history and the cost of freedom, please hit that subscribe button and smash that like button. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought of this complete tale, which chapter disturbed you most. What do you think happened to the survivors? Did they find true freedom, or did they carry their chains in other forms? Share your thoughts, theories, and reactions in the comments below. And if you want more macabre horror stories rooted in dark history, let me know what historical events you'd like me to explore next. Thank you for walking through this nightmare with me. Until next time, remember, some debts are paid in blood, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.